Brothers and sisters, welcome back to the Behaviour Revolution Scriptures. My name's Mark. Are you enjoying this series? Are you getting much out of it? I know I am. This whole fresh new way of looking at Scripture is just blowing my brains. It's what I've needed to go into the Word, to have a reason to go in there to say, what would Yahushua say and do if he was walking amongst us today? Not how would he have been back then, because we can read how he was back then, but we need to come back and know how to behave today, because that's what affected people back in his time. He was quoting a lot of scriptures that had already been written by Moshe and lots of other people, but it was his behavior. It's what they saw when they looked into his eyes. It's who he was, that light that we talked about, that life that was swelling inside him that he gave to people. This loving kindness that they felt, this drunken intoxication when they looked into his eyes. Have you felt that before? Because that's what Yahushua offers all of us to have all day, every day. And if we're not in it, then we got more overcoming to do. Overcoming the world, overcoming who we think we are, the rights we think we have, behaviours we think we're allowed to do. And that's what the scripture's for. Not to just be a mimic. They were wearing that, so we have to wear that, and they were eating that, so we have to eat that, and they were going to that place, so we have to go to that place. No, the whole of Scripture is a behavioural manual. It's not there to show us those, it's there to teach us how Yahushua feels about this behaviour, and that behaviour, and that behaviour. So when Abraham did this, then that's how Yahushua felt about that behaviour. But when he did this, he felt about that behaviour. It's to show us how Yahushua feels about different behaviours. So that we today, here, now in the 21st century, know what behaviours please Yahushua, so that we can be obedient. Because that's what our worship is. That's what worship today is, obedient behaviour. So if we're not going to be obedient to what the Torah, to what Yahushua's instructions say, what are we on this journey for? We're on this journey to overcome the world. What's my life for? Why was I born? Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? The meaning of life. What is your meaning of life? Do you know what the meaning of life is? What are you on this earth for? Because Yahushua wants you. And in order for him to have you, you need to overcome the world. So brothers and sisters, keep diving into this. It's totally refreshing and life-giving and amazing for me. I mean, I've started going through the Exodus now, Shemoth, reinterpreting, rewriting, all those sort of things. And so I've had a couple of weeks off the videos. You wouldn't know that because I'm just putting them out there for you. But I'm coming back now to finish off Genesis, Bereshith, because we're going to go into an amazing story now about Yusuf. Yusuf is pretty much the last main character that Yahushua uses in this amazing book of Genesis. So let's go there, guys. In our last episode, we finished off talking about Yaakov and how he buried his father, Yitzhak, and then we had a very short video about Reuben, that sneaky, depraved Raven, trying to get his foot up on the firstborn inheritance and all that sort of thing. So we've got a picture here of where we're at so far. Yaakov, Yisrael, he had 2 blood covenant wives and he had 2 servant wives. Zilpah was Leah's servant and Rachel was Bilhah's servant. And this isn't the ideal pattern, guys. Don't start thinking, okay, like I said in the beginning, this isn't to show us, oh, he had four wives, I'm allowed to have 4 wives. Oh, can you imagine it? So this is to show us what Yahushua was permitting at that time, because the focus was very different. It didn't seem to offend him too much either that there were multiple different idols and deities going on. I'm not saying it didn't bother him, but I'm saying it wasn't the focus of Genesis, of Bereshith. It's not his focus to prove to the world that I'm the only living Elohim. That comes in our next amazing book of Shemoth, Exodus, where he's going to blast open everybody's idea about, deities and how many there are and what's going on and the power of the false idols. He's going to blast it all apart in the land of Egypt and show them who's who and who he really is, with an outstretched arm and da-di-da-di-da. So That's what happens next. But right now, he's permitting all these things to go on. And there's madness happening here. And now there's so many children on the scene. Look at this picture. Now there's so many children on the scene. They're at each other's throats about multiple different issues. About the birthright, about this, about that. And as we discussed in other videos, 𝗪𝗏 has two main blood covenant wives. So therefore he's got two main, Reuben, that was his firstborn, that was his main firstborn, because he was the oldest child. But it wasn't his favourite wife, Leah, was it? Rachel was his favourite wife. So his true firstborn, in his mind, to inherit all the promises and everything, would be Yusuf as far as favoritism goes. Because this here, Yusuf, Benjamin, Rachel, this was the family he initially wanted. Not saying he didn't love his other children, I'm saying this was in his mind what he wanted. He wanted to marry Rachel. He loved Rachel, and these are her children. And all this menagerie of children and family and all the squawking and bickering going on in the background, this was what he truly wanted. But Yahusha allowed other things to go on too, to grow the family, because Yahusha had a plan. The whole point was to grow his bride, to grow his blood covenant people, the 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 sons are going to turn into 12 tribes. We haven't come to that point in the story yet. That's where we're heading, to the 12 tribes of Israel. And we also looked in the other videos about the fact that 𝗪𝗏 was the first man in these stories that actually only had circumcised Hebrew blood covenant children. He didn't produce any nations. He didn't produce any goyim. Abraham had both nations, goyim, and he had Hebrews. And Yitzhak had the same, because he had 𝗪𝗏 and Esau. Nations, goyim, and Hebrews. But 𝗪𝗏 only has Hebrews. He only has blood covenant children. So what's going to happen with these 12 tribes of Israel? Are they aware that they are in a blood covenant? I'm sure they are. They're all circumcised. They're all been taught by their father. But how's their behaviour? Look at the firstborn, who should know better. Reuben, what's he doing? What about Reuben? What about Shimeon and Louis? They're the two that went on the big bloodbath to avenge the rape of their sister, Dinah. What about her? Chuffing off into the city to have a good time. And what happened to her? That's what happens if you go into the world, guys. You'll get ripped to shreds, you know? So all these children doing all this mad wickedness. And Yehuda, we're going to come into Yehuda shortly about what he gets up to. But he redeems himself in the end and changes his behaviour and comes good. We don't hear much more about the others except Yusuf and Benjamin. But the whole point of where we're going today with Yusuf is to say that we're going to step back and say, yes, it's horrible and horrific what's going to happen to Yusuf. But just like Abraham had to go through a test pit, he had to be dropped into a test pit and prove his behaviour to become Abraham. Abram had to become Abraham through testing, through trial, through flogging. He had to go through agony with his choices, with his behaviour. Yitzhak was the same. 𝗪𝗏, what an arrogant little thing 𝗪𝗏 is, manipulative and deceiving people and taking the birthright off his brother and then sneakily getting it off his father and doing all this stuff. And so he has to be taken from his family, nearly 1,000 k's north, where he gets scammed himself. He gets manipulated out of the firstborn daughter. He gets all this stuff happen to him. So he has to go through a crucible of fire as well. Because you can't be used by Yahusha with all this self in the way. With all this old man, all this arrogance, all this who I think I am and I can do this and I can do that. And no, that has to be purged until you surrender, you give over to what Yahusha wants in your life. And if you're not willing to do that, you clearly just enjoy pain, because it's agony not going where Yahusha wants you to do, where he wants you to go. So let's go. Enough jammering from me. Just keep these 12 people in your mind, because that's the whole point of this book of Bereshith. We're coming to the conclusion you know. We're crescendoing into a grand climactic event that's going to happen here with these 12 people. So we went into what Raven did, and we saw Esau's family tree, and now we're coming to Yusuf. So just keep in mind that there's a purpose behind all this. Yahusha's doing something. Isn't that an amazing coloured coat? This is someone's interpretation of it, and I like it, so it's there. So Yusuf, this is the guy we used to call Joseph. His real name is Yusuf, and his royal tunic. Yisrael, that's Yaqub, Yisrael, settled in Hebron, in the land of Canaan, where his father had travelled years before. And this is the account of how Yahusha blessed and increased his family. That's what this is. This is the account of how Yahusha blessed and increased his family. Because at this point, he's only got 12 sons and a daughter that we know of, and those sons have probably got offspring by now too. But we don't have a huge multitude of people yet, do we? But the good thing is, Israel has settled in the promised land. It's where he's supposed to be. Covered with surrounded by the covenant and the protection of Yahusha's instructions and promises. So he's happy about that. He doesn't want to go anywhere or do anything. He's happy he's in the promised land. So this is the account of how Yahusha blessed and increased his family. When Yusuf was 17 years old, remember Yusuf is the firstborn of Rachel. Remember Rachel waited for ages to have a child. She sent Yaqub off with her servant wife to have children, and Leah's concubine, Leah's servant wife had children. Leah had children, and finally Rachel had a son, named him Yusuf. So this was Yaqub's first child with his favourite wife. So when Yusuf was 17 years old, he helped in the tending of his father's flocks, working for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's servant wives Bilhah and Zilpah. And Yusuf was up himself. Almost a bit up himself. Bit of the arrogance sniffing around there. Yusuf was up himself, always snitching on his brothers. Snitch, bitch. Snitching on his brothers. And lifting himself up in the eyes of everybody. Snitch. One of those annoying little siblings that kept running around, dobbing on everybody. Dobbers wearing nappies. You know, like, he's a snitch. He's up himself. Thinks he's amazing, probably because of the favour he gets from his father. Thinks he's the ant's pants mate. And he's snitching on everybody. Going around causing trouble, dobbing. And Yisrael loved Yusuf more than all his other children, because Rachel, his favourite wife, had given birth to Yusuf in his old age. So he had his stuff together. He was getting older. He had his parenting, his styles, and his opinions, and his life's experiences, and his wisdom, things you get as you get older. He just had his stuff together. And so this child, he could enjoy it like like when people have grandchildren, they enjoy them much more because there's no pressure. You don't have the pressure of, you've had more life experience, so you enjoy it more. So he had, Rachel had Yusuf when Yaqub, or Yisrael, was very old. So it was his favourite child. So Yisrael had a beautiful, multicoloured and ornamented royal tunic made for his son Yusuf. But after giving him this very special gift, his brothers hated Yusuf even more because they saw how much their father loved and favoured him. So they treated him harshly and had nothing but cruel, horrible things to say to him. Can relate to that? I've got lots of children in this house. If I chose to show any intense favoritism towards one child for more than 5 minutes, everybody would be up in arms. How come he got one of those? I didn't get one of those. So if ever there's anything we need to get them all the same, get them all the same colour. If it's food, get them all the same flavour, so there's no fights, no favoritism. Heaven forbid you lift any child up more than any other. No, you've got to treat everybody the same, all right? Might be mad, but that everybody's got their precious little princess feelings that get hurt, all right? So, of course, Yahusha has favourites. Yahusha favours those who behave themselves. Yahusha favours those who want to please him. You know? So, let's go. So his brothers hated him because he was favoured. He was a favourite son. And in this circumstance, it wasn't necessarily because of anything he did or his behaviour, just because of who he was in the pecking order with the favourite wife. So that would have made them more angrier because they're working hard for their father and he's lifting up some other younger son who's a little brat. He's lifting up this brat who's up himself, dobbing on everybody. So he's milking it. Dad! He's probably getting everybody into trouble. So he gave him a multicoloured coat. His brothers are jealous and hate him. Had nothing but cruel, horrible things to say to him. Amazing in the turquoise here, amazing gifts like this were traditionally only given to the firstborn son. But due to the behaviour of his older sons, Yaqub had no favour for them. Well, Raban's out because he slept with his father's servant wife. Screwed his father's wife. Says, "You're out, mate. You're not my favourite." And his other two sons caused him huge embarrassment and heartache, and they ran because after that bloodbath that those two murderous sons did, always causing trouble and murder. So those two are out. They were the three older children. You couldn't stand those three children because of their behaviour. So now we've got Yaqub. And until I studied this and looked into the family tree and everything, I realised, well, Yaqub actually is his firstborn from that wife. So in his mind, he's giving his firstborn, who he still favours, an amazing gift like you would give to your firstborn son, because he's going to inherit everything you are anyway. So amazing gifts like this were traditionally only given to the firstborn son. But due to the behaviour of his older sons, Yaqub had no favour for them. One night, Yusuf had a dream. And in the morning, he came to his brothers saying, "Check out this wild dream I had last night, guys. We were out in the field tying up all the sheaves of grain, and suddenly mine stood up. And then all your bundles all gathered around and bowed down before mine and worshipped it." And when his brothers heard this, they despised Yusuf even more because of the dream and the way he spoke about them. And they wouldn't let him have it inside themselves. No way. They were saying to him, "You think you're going to be our king, do you? You really think you're better than us and will reign over us, you fool." Soon Yusuf had another dream, and once again he told his brothers about it. "Hey dudes, I had another dream last night. The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to worship me." Yusuf had 11 brothers. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to worship me. What a little turd, talking to his brothers like that. But this time he told his father also about the dream. But his father rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this? What kind of dream is that? Will your mothers and I and all your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? What nonsense." So even his father, who's usually blowing hot air up his quit, he's telling him off. "Come on, that's ridiculous. Stop lifting yourself up like that. You're ridiculous. Nonsense." However, while his brothers dismissed the dreams as stuck-up ramblings and were hatefully jealous of Yusuf, his father Yisrael held onto them in his mind and actually wondered what the dreams might mean. Because dreams meant a lot back then, because that's often how Yahushua appeared to people, in dreams. And they didn't have the understanding or the perspective of time that we've got and seen all the different ways Yahushua can appear. So he kept it in his mind. He pondered, he thought about it. Wonder what it means. But of course his brothers dismissed it. "You up yourself, mate. Get out of here." And they hated him. Not long after this, Yusuf's brothers went out to feed their father's flocks at Shechem. But when they had been gone for some time, 𝔹𝕖𝕙𝕒𝕚𝕚 said to Yusuf, "Your brothers are out feeding the sheep at Shechem. Quick, get ready and I'll send you out to them." "Okay, Dad, I'm ready to go," Yusuf replied. "Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing. Then come back and tell me." So 𝔹𝕖𝕙𝕒𝕚 sent him out, and Yusuf travelled about 80 kilometres to Shechem from their home in the valley of Kebron. 80 kilometres. It's a long way, isn't it? On foot or donkey, whatever he had. When he arrived there, a man from the area noticed him wandering around the countryside. "What's up, bro?" he said. "I'm looking for my brothers. They're feeding my father's sheep. Do you know where they are?" Yusuf replied. "Yes," the man told him. "They have moved further on from here, but I overheard them saying they were heading for Dothan." So Yusuf followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. But when Yusuf's brothers saw him approaching, they recognized him in the distance, and their seething hatred flared up. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Look, here comes our annoying asshat brother, the dreamer. Let's kill him and throw him into a hole, and we'll finally be rid of him. We'll just tell our father that a savage animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what happens to his stuck-up dreams. Then we'll see what happens to his stuck-up dreams. Here comes our annoying asshat of a brother." They hated him, mate. But when Reuben, the oldest son, heard of their murderous scheme, he came to Yusuf's defense. That's interesting. "Why bother killing him and shedding his blood? Let's just throw him into this deep pit. And out here in the wilderness, he'll just die without us having to do anything." Reuben had recently caused enough drama with his father and was secretly planning to rescue Yusuf. So he didn't want to kill him, just throw him in this pit. And before Yusuf had arrived, Reuben left his brothers for a short time to see about a matter. And when Yusuf greeted them, the first thing his brothers did was assault him and rip off the beautiful coloured robe he was wearing, before grabbing him violently and throwing him into the deep pit. For it was empty with no water, only snakes and scorpions. There were snakes and scorpions in there. So they ripped off his coat because they hated this coat of his. It was the bane of their existence, this coat, telling us to bow down before you. "Who do you think you are?" Yusuf cried out and wailed for help. So he's screaming, crying, making a huge scene. He's petrified. He's only a young teenager here, crying out and wailing for help, getting more and more distressed and afraid of the snakes and the scorpions. But his brothers wouldn't answer him. They even moved away from the sound of his weeping. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, feeling quite good about themselves, He's in this pit, weeping and wailing, petrified of the snakes and scorpions. He's having a fit. And they've moved away so they don't have to hear him. And they're eating like it's nothing. See how wicked they are? Jealousy, envy, wicked. So just as they sat down to eat, feeling quite good about themselves, they saw a caravan of camels in the distance, coming towards them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders, taking a load of spices, balms and myrrh from Gilead down to Egypt. So these Ishmaelite traders are descendants of Ishmael. Yeah? Abram's first son. And Yehuda said to his brothers, "If we kill Yusuf, we'll just have to cover up the crime and we'll gain nothing. So instead of hurting him, let's pawn him off to those Ishmaelite terrorists." That's what they were. They were violent people. They were like terrorists. Very unstable and erratic. So instead of hurting Yusuf, let's pawn him off to those Ishmaelite terrorists. After all, he's still our brother, our own flesh and blood. Well, that's nice. He's got a little bit of humanity. We won't kill him, we'll just sell him. Well done, Yehuda. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders and a violent people, came by, Yusuf's brothers pulled him out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took Yusuf to Egypt. Cheerio, Yusuf, he's gone. They took him to Egypt. Not long after, Laban returned to the pit to rescue Yusuf, and when he discovered that he was gone, he panicked and tore his clothes. That's what they did in this time when they were grieved. That's what Yaakov did after the big bloodbath, remember, in the city? What his sons had done. They ripped their clothes. Whatever head coverings they'd come off, they'd take theirs, they'd shave theirs, they'd do all this stuff. They'd rip their clothes and they'd do all this dramatic stuff. So Laban ripped his clothes in grief, panicking. Then he found his brothers and cried, "What the hell have you done? The boy is gone. What will I do now? Where can I go? I'm the oldest. He was my responsibility. What will our father do to me?" So we've seen what happened to Laban in the chapter before, in the video before, sleeping with his father's servant wife, and the STD, the infection he got in his groin, and his father had to pray over him, and he hasn't been the same since, still can't look his father in the eye. Now what's going to happen? His favourite son's gone. It was my responsibility. I'm the oldest. The buck stops here. It will fall on top of me, this blame. Then the devious brothers thought it nothing to kill one of their father's young goats that they were supposed to be looking after. Just killed one of them. And they dipped Yusuf's colourful coat in its blood. Then they returned home and took the beautiful coat, all ripped and bloody, to their father, saying, "Look what we found out in the field. Doesn't this robe belong to Yusuf?" Like they didn't know. "Doesn't this robe belong to Yusuf?" I'm so innocent. And Yisrael went pale, recognizing it immediately. "Yes, it's my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him." And Yisrael tore his clothes and wept bitterly. He didn't just cry, he wept bitterly, bawled his eyes out, weeping bitterly. "My wonderful Yusuf has been torn to pieces." And seeing their father wailing unstoppably, the brothers wept also, and a wave of thick grief came over the whole household. And Yisrael fell down to the ground, as still as a stone in shock. And Yehuda nursed his father's head as tears gushed down Yisrael's face. Yisrael wore sackcloth on his waist and mourned deeply for his son for a very long time. His family all tried to support and love him, but he refused to be comforted. "I will go to my grave missing and longing for my son," he'd say, and then he would burst into tears again. So he never gets over it. He's never the same again, really. He never gets over the death of his son. And interestingly, in other translations, even though his name has been changed to Yisrael, the scripture goes back to calling him Yaakov, because he's lost. It's almost like he's lost his belief. He's lost his promises of who he is, and the fact that Yahusha's protecting him, and he's forgotten about all that. He's just in grief. Misses his son. It was his favourite son of his favourite wife, who's now dead as well. So all he's got left from that small little family is Benjamin. So he's in total grief, and he's kind of lost the plot. That's where Yaakov, or Yisrael, is at this point in the story. So Yusuf gets taken to Egypt. Yusuf was taken to Egypt by Ishmaelite traders, and he was sold to Potiphar. Potiphar, not Potiphar, Potiphar, who was an officer of the Pharaoh himself, the king of Egypt. Now we're talking a lot about the Pharaoh here. Other translations, the BYNV has changed that PH to an F. Pharaoh, calls him Pharaoh. Gives him a flick back hairdo. Farrah Fawcett, huh? No. I didn't choose to do that because we're in the 21st century, and I didn't want people to think that was someone's name. We all are very familiar with the Pharaoh, and so I've just kept it as the Pharaoh. I've kept it as Egypt as well, because we know where Egypt is. I'm trying to make it easy here, right? Names of people, I've taken into the Hebrew because, you know, that's their name. You should at least have that much respect for a person. Call them by their real name, Hebrew name. But Pharaoh is not a name. Pharaoh is a position, it's a title, like Mr. President, the President, the Abimelech, the Pharaoh. So we've just keeping it simple. Egypt, Pharaoh. Use real words, Mark, so we can understand you. He went to Egypt and he was taken to Potiphar, who was an officer of the Pharaoh himself, the king of Egypt, and also the captain of the palace guard. This is interesting, guys. Tune into this, because I didn't know any of this. A few decades before this, the Egyptians, so the Egyptians are descendants of Noach's cursed son, Ham. If you haven't been following these videos, Noach's son Ham, who was cursed because his pervy little son Ham and his son Canaan, they were cursed. They were the cursed line. Sodom and Gomorrah came out of that line. Nimrod came out of that line. The Egyptians came out of that line. So they've got very dark skin. The Egyptians their skin is a lot darker than the Hebrews. The Hebrews had brown skin, possibly darker brown skin, but quite dark skin, but they're not black. Egyptians were black. So a few decades before this, the Egyptians, who are the descendants of Noach's cursed son Ham, had been invaded and conquered by Shemites. Who are Shemites? Descendants of Shem, obviously. Noach's sons were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the Egyptians. Shem was the Hebrews. Abraham is a descendant of Shem. This was the blood covenant line. But there were also other Shemites, lots of different descendants, because remember, Abraham had nations as well as chosen Hebrews, and so did Ishmael, but Jacob didn't. So ever since way back at Shem, he's had lots of descendants. So the Shemites were descendants of Shem. But because Abraham and Yitzhak and Jacob are also descendants of Shem, that makes them kind of cousins. They'd have lighter skin. Shemites have lighter skin. The Shemites are desert-dwelling Asian descendants of Noach's son Shem, making the current Egyptian dynasty tribal cousins of Yisrael's family, because the Hebrews were also descendants of Shem. So the Pharaoh sitting on the throne of Egypt wasn't even Egyptian, but Potiphar was. Did you understand that? I'm going to go through that again. A few decades before Yusuf arrives, Egypt had been conquered and invaded by the Shemites, which were desert-dwelling Asian descendants of Noach's son Shem, making the current Egyptian dynasty, tribal cousins of Yisrael's family, because the Hebrews were also descendants of Shem. So the Shemites, the Asian descendants, the gypsy type people who lived in the desert, and Abraham's descendants were like tribal cousins, because they all came from the line of Shem. So they would have had similar colour skin, not as dark, not as black as the Egyptians. So they conquered Egypt. So the Pharaoh that sits on the throne right now has lighter skin, much to the disgrace and disgust of the Egyptians. They'd been conquered by lighter skinned people. So this is interesting to see why things happen as they go on. So the Pharaoh that's the main thing to understand here. The Pharaoh that's sitting on the throne of Egypt wasn't even Egyptian, but Potiphar was Egyptian. You got that? We have a lighter skinned Pharaoh, a lighter skinned Yusuf. We have the Shemites that have lighter skin, and we have Abraham's descendants that have lighter skin. Lighter shade of black, lighter shade of brown was what I'm saying. Not lighter skin like me, because that's thousands of years later. But I'm saying they're not black as black, like the Egyptians were. Do you understand that? This was all interesting to see the economics and the racial thing that's going on here, and what happens with Yusuf and why and how. to see the background of it. So you got that? The Pharaoh is an Egyptian. They've been conquered by Egypt's been conquered by the Shemites. And Yahusha was with Yusuf, allowing him to succeed in everything he did while serving in the house of his new master. And even Potiphar noticed how everything seemed to flow smoothly and work successfully for Yusuf in all his dealings within the house. And this pleased him a lot. So even though in his own household, Yusuf was a little bit of a brat, and as a teenager, he's, milking this whole favoritism thing, getting away with whatever he wants. He still was trained by Yusuf. He would have spent more time with, not Yusuf, Yaqub, Israel. He was trained by his father and would have spent a lot more time with his father being his favorite. So everything would have been poured into him from Yaqub about Yahusha and how to live and how to behave. So even Potiphar noticed everything seemed to flow smoothly around Yusuf. And knowing he could trust in Yusuf's steadfast behavior, that was what impressed him. Yusuf's steadfast behavior. He stayed the same. He was organized, had everything disciplined and in order. Potiphar knew he could trust in Yusuf's steadfast behavior. He promoted Yusuf to the chief servant over all his household, so that he personally managed and oversaw every duty within all his properties. And as soon as this happened, Yahusha began blessing Potiphar too, because correct behavior brings blessing. Correct behavior brings peace, brings favor from Yahusha. We can all learn from this. Order, discipline, routine. So he personally managed and oversaw everything in property. As soon as all this happened, Yahusha began blessing Potiphar too. His crops and livestock flourished, and all the household affairs ran uber smoothly. So finally, Potiphar gave Yusuf complete responsibility and rule over everything he owned. Because with Yusuf around, he didn't have to worry about anything, not even the food he ate. He practically made this guy his personal assistant, his second in charge to himself. These days in the 21st century, husbands and wives would work like that. You're each other's second in charge, depending on how your household functions. But back in those days, the wives were doing other things. They were almost treated like possessions in one aspect. So your second in charge was a great responsibility. And this guy was a slave. Yusuf was a slave. And Potiphar wasn't a Hebrew. Potiphar wasn't a Shemite. Potiphar was an Egyptian, pure-blooded Egyptian, black skin. So he wasn't showing any racial favoritism there. So for Yusuf to impress Potiphar that much, his behavior must have been stellar. So Yusuf's now the boss, basically. So Potiphar's going off to do all this stuff with the Pharaoh because he's an officer of the Pharaoh. He's going to do his official business, knowing that he doesn't have to worry about anything at home, doesn't have to worry about the food, the crops, anything. Yusuf is looking after everything. Didn't even have to worry about the food he ate. Here we go. Yusuf was very easy on the eyes. He was tall, dark and handsome, and very well built. And Potiphar's wife began flirting with him and looking at him with eyes full of lust. One day she approached him seductively, battering her eyelids. "Yusuf, come into my chamber," she whispered in his ear. But Yusuf refused and continued on with his work. So she tried again the next day, a little stronger. "I want you to come and lay with me. I promise you'll like it." But he turned and said, "Look, how can I do such a wicked thing? My master trusts me with everything in his entire household, and no one has more authority here than me. He has held nothing back from me except you, because you are his wife. It would be a great evil in the eyes of my Elohim." It would be like today, having a personal assistant who is allowed to go through your computer, through your wallet, through your phone, through your everything. Like celebrities have personal assistants that do everything. They handle everything. The celebrity sits back, does nothing. So Yusuf was allowed through his master's desktop drawers. He could rifle through anything. He could go through any of his master's business about anything. His master trusted him 100%. His character. He knew that if he was doing something there, he was running the place. He knew what he was doing, paying the bills, working out the crops, feeding the servants, looking after the household and everything. He fully trusted him. So that's why Yusuf says, my master has held nothing back from me, except you. I can't go into you because that would be a great evil in the eyes of my Elohim. So he's behaving as his Elohim, as Yahushua wants him to. In the face of wickedness, in the face of lust, in the face of a pagan wicked system that often wrote off any kind of sexual conduct as just worship to an idol. It's okay, we're worshipping our idol. This is how we do it. Like they just make excuses for their own lust and depravity and say we're worshipping an idol. That's how we do it. It's paganism. So Yusuf's turned her down. But she kept pressuring him day in and day out. But he refused to have sex with her and began avoiding her as much as possible. One day, however, when no one was around, she came and grabbed him by his loincloth. What's a loincloth? Tiny little skirt thing. There's a picture there. That's some artist's interpretation. See his little loincloth there? I've had to darken up their skin a bit because they would have been, well, Yusuf, that's probably how Yusuf looked, but she would have been black, she would have been blacker than that. Come on, honey, come and sleep with me. No one will ever know, I promise. And Yusuf tore himself away from her, but he left his loincloth in her hand as he ran from the house. So after being completely rejected and seeing that she was still holding his loincloth, Potiphar's wife screamed out loudly, causing all the servants of the house to come running. Look, she cried. My husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to humiliate us all. Yusuf came into my room to rape me, but when he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away. But look, I grabbed his loincloth. Look here. And she kept the loincloth until her husband, Potiphar, returned home. Then she told him her sneaky lie. That Hebrew slave you brought into our home attacked me today and tried to have his way with me. But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his loincloth here with me. It's bad enough that these hideous people rule over us, but why did you have to bring one into our home? So they hated the lighter-skinned people. They hated the Shemites. They hated the Hebrews. They were quite racist, the Egyptians. They thought they were El Supremo. It's quite different to how history goes on down the line, isn't it? How the black people are treated. They were quite racist. And after Potiphar heard his wife slandering Yusuf's character, he knew she was lying. He knew she was lying. He knew Yusuf. Do you think I'd put someone over my household if I hadn't been watching him for so long and knew his character and his behaviour? Wife, on the other hand, I mean, if the wife's willing to do that with the servant man, what's she up to with everybody else? So after Potiphar heard his wife slandering Yusuf's character, he knew she was lying, and he spared Yusuf's life. However, because of his political position, he needed to save face. So he seized Yusuf and threw him into the prison, where the king's prisoners were held. And there Yusuf stayed. So it didn't seem like it was the common prison. It was the prison where the king's prisoners were held. So it was a bit more cushy. And there he stayed. So he's gone from being a slave to being the boss of the household to being back in prison again. But Yahushua was with Yusuf in the prison and allowed him to feel his loving kindness. He also gave him favour with the prison warden, And before long, the warden put Yusuf in charge. Here we go again, he's been lifted up again. He's been put in charge of all the other prisoners and gave him authority over everything that happened in the prison. And because of Yusuf's hard work and trustworthy behaviour, the warden had no more worries because Yusuf looked after everything. Is this your behaviour, guys? If you are an employee, is this your behaviour? If you are a wife, a husband, if you are a child, if you are living under someone else's home, if you are children, is this how you are to your parents? And is this how we are in our lives, whether you are the boss or the employer? Is this how we treat other people? Is this how we behave? Because of Yusuf's hard work and trustworthy behaviour. Further up there it said steadfast. He was like a rock. People knew when they were in his company what his mood, what his behaviour, what his words, how he would be. He was reliable. He wasn't just up and down and tossed and turned on every wave of mood and emotion. One minute he's hitting the roof, emotions flying, telling people off. The next minute he's quiet like a mouse in some kind of mood. He's not just hurling around on all this emotional roller coaster. He's steadfast. Potiphar could trust him, and now the prison warden can trust him. He's put him in charge of the prison. This guy I look after, I can kick back, put my feet up, do something else. This guy I look after the prison, even though he's a prisoner himself. I know he's not going to rot the system. I know he's not going to take advantage of me. I can trust him. So his behaviour must have been shining for that decision to be made. So Yusuf looked after everything. And despite being betrayed and sold into slavery, Yusuf's active belief in Yahusha's principles, not just head knowledge rattling around, it's got to be active belief. It's got to be day to day. We live now in the 21st century. Our belief can't be what's going on here. Our belief has to be active today. When we hear something from Yahusha, is that really you, Father? Well, go and do it and find out. If it works, it must have been me, he says. If it doesn't work, well, that must have been one of your own little grand schemes. That's how we get to know Yahusha's voice. Listen and do. Hear and do. You don't always get it right because we've got unclean spirits and we've got our own feelings and emotions and desires and thoughts and schemes and plans in there. And then we've got Yahusha's voice as well. So we have to believe, I heard that from Yahusha. I'm going to try it and see what happens. And then when it works, you go, okay, you're starting to hear you're starting to get used to the tone and the frequency of Yahusha's voice. And you're starting to realise that it's a little bit different to the spirits, unclean spirits, and it's different to your own ideas. You're starting to tune into Yahusha's voice. If you never practice, what experience are you having? Oh, you can learn all these scriptures back to front and quote scriptures and their chapters and their verses, what uses that. But is your belief active in your day to day? Yusuf's active belief in Yahusha's principles. So despite being betrayed and sold into slavery, Yusuf's active belief in Yahusha's principles that he'd been taught by his father allowed him to be cool, calm and collected and handle everything. It's cool, baby. No problems. Nothing's a problem. He doesn't fly off the handle. He handles everything. Yusuf's active belief allowed him to be cool, calm and collected and handle everything well in the prison. And Yahusha caused everything he did to prosper and succeed. And that's the goal here. Do you want to have favour with Yahusha? Now we can say, oh, he's no respecter of persons. Yes, but he favours those who please him like any father would. He favours those who want to make him happy, who are obedient to what he asks us to do. Not because our obedience gives us deliverance and we have to earn our salvation and all this BS they go on with. No, that's just an excuse. If you love someone, your husband, your wife, you do what they like. You do what they want you to do. You want to please them, don't you? You get to know them and then you do what makes them happy. And in this case, Yahusha wants us to follow his instructions that are for our benefit anyway. So, and everything will prosper and succeed if we do that. Yusuf the dream whisperer. Not the horse whisperer, the dream whisperer. He understood the dreams. So Yusuf's the boss of the prison. Second in charge of the prison warden anyway. And sometime later, the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. What's a cupbearer do? The cupbearer was the servant who often swallowed some of the king's wine before serving it to guard against him being poisoned. So, we read earlier up that Potiphar didn't have to worry about his food because Yusuf was in charge of the food and he knew he wasn't going to get poisoned or get any diseases from the food because Yusuf was doing a good job. Well, now, the cupbearer. The Pharaoh himself had a cupbearer so to make sure he wasn't poisoned. So if the cupbearer dropped dead, well, don't drink that bottle. Don't drink from that there. So, sometime later, the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and the Pharaoh's master chef both offended him. And in his fury, he, the Pharaoh, threw them in the prison where Yusuf was. And they were there for quite some time. We don't know what they did, but they made the Pharaoh angry, so he threw them in prison. And the captain of the guard assigned Yusuf to look after them. One night, the cupbearer and master chef both had dreams. And when Yusuf saw them when Yusuf saw them in the morning, he noticed that they both looked very upset. So he asked them, "Why the long face, fellas? What's up?" And they replied, "We both had dreams last night that freaked us out, and no one can tell us what they mean." And Yusuf didn't even flinch. "Just chill, guys. My 𝗓𝕗𝕗𝕗 can help you with that. Tell me your dreams." He's cool, man. Cool, calm, collected. Chill out, man. Tell me your dream. Yahuwah can help you with that. So the chief cupbearer told Yusuf his dream first. "In my dream, I saw a grapevine in front of me, which had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom. And soon it produced clusters of ripe, juicy grapes. I was holding the Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand. So I took some grapes and squeezed the juice into his cup. Then I placed the cup into the Pharaoh's hand. And with the wisdom of Yahushua in him, Yusuf said, 'This is what the dream means, man. The 3 branches represent 3 days. So in 3 days, you'll be out of here, mate, with your job back as the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. So when you get the chance, would you do me a favor and name drop me to the Pharaoh, please, so I can get out of here? You see, I was kidnapped from my home and my family back in the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in this dungeon, but I did nothing to deserve it.' So he's told the cupbearer what his dream means. In 3 days you're going to be released. That's what the dream means. There are 3 branches of 3 days. In 3 days you're going to get out of here. So when you do, can you drop my name to the Pharaoh? Give me a good word, a stellar reference, because I was kidnapped from my home, thrown in a dungeon. I did nothing to deserve it. And when the master chef, some translations say the chief baker, butchered the baker, the kidnap. And when the master chef saw that Yusuf had given the first dream such a positive spin, he was excited. He said to Yusuf, "I had a dream too, and there were 3 baskets of amazing white pastries all stacked on my head. And all the pastries in the top basket were for the Pharaoh. But the birds came along and ate everything from the basket on my head." And Yusuf said, "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days, because in 3 days the Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a stake. Then the birds will come and peck away at your flesh." Not quite positive response he was looking for, yeah? So you're dead, man. In 3 days he's going to impale your body on a stake and the birds will come and peck away at your flesh. 3 days later, it was the Pharaoh's birthday. This is the first instance in Scripture we hear about a birthday. A wicked pagan birthday. Because we don't see as much here, but we're going to see in Exodus, in the Shemoth, just how many deities they were and how they worshipped them and all the wicked things they had to do. So 3 days later, it was the Pharaoh's birthday, and he prepared a banquet in his honor, because the Pharaoh was like a deity himself. People worshipped him. They thought he was immortal. So he prepared a banquet in his honor for all his officials, and he brought his chief cupbearer and his master chef to stand before his guests. Then he gave the chief cupbearer back his job so he could hand the Pharaoh his cup again. But Pharaoh had the master chef impaled, just as Yusuf had predicted when he interpreted his dream. But after this event, the chief cupbearer went straight back to work and forgot all about Yusuf and never said anything to the Pharaoh for 2 whole years. 2 whole years nothing was said about Yusuf, even though this guy had told him everything that's going to happen to him, and it happened. Nothing was said. So Yusuf worked in the prison for 2 years. Then, one night, the Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the swamp grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were thick, sickly, scrawny, thin cows. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. And at this point in the dream, the Pharaoh woke up in a hot sweat. But falling asleep again, he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled up and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then the Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was all a dream. The next morning, though, he was very disturbed by the dreams. So he called for all the magicians, diviners, and wise men of Egypt. And when he told them his dream, none of them could tell him what they meant. So finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up and said, "Oh, great Pharaoh, I've screwed up big time. I've screwed up big time, oh great Pharaoh. A couple of years ago, you imprisoned me in the palace of the captain of the guard, and one night your old master chef and I both had dreams. And there was a young Hebrew man with us who interpreted our dreams. And everything happened just as he had predicted, for I was restored to my position as your cupbearer, and the master chef was executed and impaled on a stake. And I completely forgot about him until today." So he'd stuffed up big time, and he remembered. So he told the Pharaoh that there's someone who can help you. So the Pharaoh sent for Yusuf at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. And after he shaved, changed his clothes, and was made to look royally presentable, he went in and stood before the Pharaoh. Then the Pharaoh said to Yusuf, "I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that you can interpret them." And Yusuf said, "It is way beyond my power to do this. However, my Elohim Yahuwah can put your mind at ease, no problems." Cool, calm, collected. So the Pharaoh told Yusuf his dreams about the thin cows eating the fat cows, and the withered up heads of grain devouring the plump heads. And Yusuf responded, "Both of the Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. Yahuwah is telling you in advance of what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity." So the 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy grains both represent 7 healthy years of prosperity, while the 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain, withered by the east wind, they represent 7 years of famine. So we've got 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of famine. And this will definitely go down as you have seen it, because Yahuwah is telling you right now what he's going to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine and such scarcity of food that all the good years of fat abundance will be nothing but a distant memory, for it will destroy all the land. Now, great Pharaoh, you've practically had the same dream twice now, which means 𝗂𝗓𝗓𝐿 is telling you this is really going to happen. So you should find an intelligent, wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt, appointing supervisors over the whole land, and get them to collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years, and have them gather all the food from those good years and bring it into your storehouses. Store it away and guard it, so there will be food in the cities. Then there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy this whole land. And the Pharaoh was so relieved by Yusuf's interpretation and suggestions, and he rejoiced, saying to his officials, "Have you ever seen anyone? Have you ever seen anyone else so cleverly gifted with intelligence and wisdom around here? Have you ever seen anyone else so clearly gifted with intelligence and wisdom around here?" And he had wise men. It was their sole purpose to be wise. He had soothsayers, he had diviners, he had magicians. And yet he's taken this young servant from the prison, and he's so relieved, and everything Yusuf said has just rung home with him. Have you ever seen anyone else so clearly gifted with intelligence and wisdom around here? And this is the Pharaoh, the one that everybody from foreign nations visits, bows down before, brings gifts, brings wisdom, brings prophecies, brings everything to this man. And he's so impressed with Yusuf. So what's flowing through Yusuf? There's only one being that can be flowing through Yusuf to be so impressive. The same being that flows within us. Yahusha. That's how impressive he was to a pagan king. So we're going to leave it there for this video, guys. And next video, we're going to go into a bit of a side story about Yehuda and his little mischievous adventure. Because as the story branches out, and we're going to go into this next episode, we've got 2 key players on the lineage line. We've got Yusuf and we've got Yehuda. Why is Yehuda special? When he's not the eldest, he's not the favourite, he's not this, he's not that. Why is Yehuda special? We're going to find out. And Yusuf, of course, is now in prison, but it looks like, and I've given it away by the next heading, Yusuf, the governor of Egypt. He gets risen up to be the governor. In a short time, he got risen up to be the chief, the boss in Potiphar's household, gets thrown into prison, falsely accused, and he gets raised up to be boss of the prison, second in charge, and not falsely accused but forgotten about, and now he gets raised up to be the boss of the nation, second in charge of the Pharaoh. So can you see how he's constantly being falsely accused, lifted up because of his behaviour, falsely accused, lifted up, forgotten about, lifted up. He's going through this process of, in the highs, seeing what Yahusha's going to do, and in the lows, seeing that this is his process. He has to have this fiery test bit experience with Yahusha, so that all of the arrogance, all of the cockiness of who he was back then and there with his family is gone from him. Yahusha's giving him life experiences. It's giving him hardship. It says that in the later books of scripture. Perseverance and hardship. They bring character. They're building our character. So Yahusha is building Yusuf's character because he's going to do something amazing with him. This is the first time, apart from a few little jaunts from Abraham, that his people are in Egypt. And that's the whole purpose of Yusuf being taken to Egypt, to get Yahusha's people out of the promised land, which they're clearly taking for granted and not behaving properly, because look at Yaqub's sons, sleeping with his father's wife, slaughtering people. They've got no respect for who they are, don't even know who they are. what they're supposed to be doing. Their behavior is disgusting. So Yahushua is going to pull them from the promised land and put them into Egyptian prosperity to start with. And then of course we know it turns into slavery. And that's what the whole life of Yusuf is for. It's all about Yahusha's promised people and his blood covenant line. Because remember, don't lose sight of this. The whole point was to get his promised family back to the Garden of Eden. How is he going to convert the world? How is he going to show the world that he wanted them to be back in his garden? And he wanted to deliver them. How is he going to do that? He was raising up a people to be an example, to be a witness. And he was starting with the 12 sons of Jacob. They were supposed to be his prized possession, a chosen multitude of people, an assembly of nations. So I'll leave it there, brothers and sisters. We've got some more amazing things to go into. Love you. See you later.